Today we have in studio with us Pastor Greg Laurie. We're going to be talking about his new book. I think you're going to find that fascinating, but also be talking about one of the Harvest Crusades coming up and giving you a chance to interact on a number of different issues. Greg Laurie has been with us, just think about this, in all three major studios. Yes. We had one over there at Spring Lake, and that goes way back many years ago, and I think that's when we talked about Lost Boy.
Yes.
And matter of fact, your co-author's here today. Ellen's here.
That's right.
And then, of course, we spent some time in the last studio talking about some of the various Harvest Crusades, and now this new book on Steve McQueen. So you've been around for a while. I guess we've both been around for a while, haven't we?
I guess we have, but thank you for having me back again, Kerby.
Just before we get into the book, everybody that has been following you has been impressed that you've had quite a number of times with President Trump. We saw you at the Washington Cathedral. We've seen you. Of course, I'm on your Instagram feed, so I see you whether you're in Maui or whether you're with the President of the United States or the Vice President, but whether it's you and Jack Graham or David Jeremiah or Ronnie Floyd or anybody, I mean, you guys are really in a position where you have a chance to speak to the president. That's really impressive.
Well, I'd say, Kerby, that this is the friendliest White House I've ever seen to evangelicals. I was there with Dr. Dobson, and he told me that, he goes back to President Reagan, where he had access to the White House. He said he has never seen a greater openness. One night that was really special is we were invited there to be with the president, and Jack was there, and Ronnie was there, and Dr. Dobson was there, and many others. And so they said, the president will be with you for 45 minutes, and that's it. We're like, great. So he ended up staying with us for like 3 hours. And then after we're done eating, wonderful meal there in the White House, little string section playing out in front of it. It was almost dreamlike. It was so amazing. And then the president says, who would like to go upstairs and see the Lincoln bedroom? All our hands shoot up. We're like little kids. I do.
I do.
It's like when I say to my grandkids, who wants to go to get ice cream? We do, Papa. So we go upstairs, and the Secret Service weren't even ready for this because normally visitors are not allowed in the private quarters. So like 40 of us go up these stairs, and we're walking down the hallway, and the president's telling us about all these photos and paintings on the walls. And then we go into the Lincoln bedroom, and I've heard about this famous bedroom, and there it is. And this is the desk that President Lincoln, wrote the Gettysburg Address on. It's kind of mind-blowing. And the whole thing was a great experience. Here's a funny thing. The president, points to that desk and says, "It's cool, huh?" He actually said, "It's cool, huh?" I thought, I didn't think I'd ever hear a president say, "It's cool, huh?"
That's a little
but
different.
It was cool.
Yeah.
And it was a great experience. But we're there to just offer biblical counsel. I was just back recently, and I had dinner with Senator Marco Rubio and Trey Gowdy, a congressman.
I saw that picture too.
And I didn't know Trey was a believer, and then a couple of other senators. And, the whole night, Kerby, we talked about the Bible.
Yes.
In fact, we talked about Pastor Jack's book on angels. I think Jack was just trying to sell some books.
Maybe so.
No, I'm kidding. But, that's what's... I think people think, oh, you guys, you're having your heads turn in Washington. Hey, we're going in there as messengers of Jesus Christ.
Right.
We're not politicians. Though I think Jack Graham should run for president. He looks like a president, doesn't he?
Yes, he does.
He has presidential hair.
Yeah.
And I don't.
Some of us don't, yeah.
No.
Yeah.
But, we're there to bring a biblical influence. We're there to speak up for Jesus Christ. And that's what we're trying to do. But, hey, we're appreciative of it. In this world in which we're living, Kerby, with North Korea literally threatening to nuke us. This is not a game.
That's my second-hour conversation.
Yeah,
We're talking North Korea, second hour today.
And
That's right.
I was in a private meeting on that last trip, and Jared Kushner came in, and I asked him about North Korea and about Iran in particular. But these are serious issues, and our president needs our prayers. If you voted for him or not, the members of his administration need our prayers. Our generals, our military, all those in service, senators, congressmen, the Bible tells us to pray for them. And if we can influence them with the truth of the Word of God, we need to do that.
Well, again, Pastor Greg Laurie in studio with us today. New book out, Steve McQueen, The Salvation of an American Icon. A little bit later, I'm also going to talk about one of the Harvest Crusades. And as I've said before, whether you can attend it or not, you can watch it online. And I've done that. Yep. And so whether you're in Atlanta or whether you're in Phoenix, or it turns out even when you were in Dallas, because of some circumstances, I even watched that one, although I could have been there face to face.
Next time I'll get you a seat, Kerby.
That would be great.
Hey, guess what? Just
what do I have to do to get a seat? Sell some of your books, I guess.
No, just ask and I'll get you a seat. And there was a lot of seats there, and by God's grace, they were all
crowded.
filled.
Yeah, and I'd rather have non-believers sitting in those seats anyway, wouldn't you?
That's very true.
Yeah.
But we're coming back again to AT&T Stadium next year.
That's right.
For one night, so I'm very excited about that.
Well, we'll talk about in August one of these opportunities for you to watch and to get your friends to watch, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. Okay. But whenever I say that Greg Laurie's new book is with Marshall Terrell about Steve McQueen, they all go, what? And, of course, all you have to do is begin to read the book, and you realize there is a remarkable parallel between the life of Steve McQueen and the life of Greg Laurie, isn't there? Yeah.
Well, when I started this book, a number of years ago, I bought a Bullitt Mustang. So if you're a car guy, you know what that is. If you aren't, there was a film called Bullitt in which Steve McQueen played the role of Detective Frank Bullitt, and he drove a 1967 Highland Green Mustang with a blacked-out grille, pony emblem removed. And it was one of the most famous cinematic car chases in film history and regarded by many as the greatest. And so, I'd been looking for one, and guess where I found it? Houston, Texas, of all places. So I was back here speaking at a pastor's conference. We went and I bought the car. My wife was not thrilled, to say the least. So maybe that was the first step in this little journey. And but now fast forward to our crusade last year. I was watching a documentary on the life of Steve McQueen. They told a story, which I've heard before, horrible childhood.
Yes.
And
we'll get into that in a minute.
Yeah, and then his ascent to fame and the #1 movie star in Hollywood. And then he got cancer and he died. That was literally the story of the film. And I thought, wait, I heard McQueen became a Christian.
Yes.
But I didn't have any firsthand knowledge of it. I'd never talked to anyone who knew him. So it started with a Google search. I just went to the search engine, typed in Steve McQueen, conversion to Christianity. One of the names that popped up was Leonard DeWitt, the pastor of the church that Steve attended, supposedly. And so I tracked Leonard down, and as it turned out, we had met earlier at a crusade we did in Ventura. So we had about an hour-long conversation, and he told me the whole story, and I thought, this is an amazing story. Most people don't know it. So I used it as a sermon illustration that night, and I had this idea, this would make a great film. So I thought, I'm going to tell this story and see if it interests others as much as it interests me. As it turns out, Mel Gibson was there that night. I was interviewing him for his new film, Hacksaw Ridge. So I'm in the back room with Mel, and I said, hey, Mel, I've been thinking about maybe doing a documentary film on Steve McQueen. And I told him Steve came to Christ, and Mel said, well, yeah, on his deathbed. I said, no, Mel, here's how it happened. So I'm telling Mel the story. We're interrupted.
Yeah.
And then the interruption's over, and Mel says, finish the story about Steve McQueen. And so that's what I'm doing. In a way, Kerby, I'm finishing the story about Steve McQueen, because the story has not been told until now, perhaps, the whole story of how Steve McQueen, not only did he come to Christ, not on his deathbed, but 6 months before he found out he had cancer, he was growing as a Christian. And in fact, he wanted to use his platform as a movie star to share his faith. And in the film that is coming out on September 28th, we've obtained audio recordings of Steve himself talking about what Christ has done for him.
We will come back and talk about the book. We have information about that, about the movie. We even have a trailer that you can watch. We'll talk about all that right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, Congress will once again take up the issue of tax reform. Although many of us would love for our taxes to be easy to calculate and simple to file, we know that won't happen in the near future. So what can be done? Well, the editors of the Wall Street Journal published a few principles we can use to evaluate the current debate about tax reform. First, there should be a priority on growth. They said after 12 years of lackluster economy or worse, tax reform's overriding goal should be to lift annual GDP to 3% or more. Second, Congress should make tax cuts immediate. There's a temptation to phase in tax cuts, but that delays any response as investors wait for lower rates in the future. George W. Bush learned that painful lesson in 2001 and corrected it in 2003. Third, make tax reform permanent. Businesses invest with a long tail and won't implement projects if lower rates may evaporate a few years from now. Again, that was a mistake that George W. Bush made. Third, tax reform should entail more than just tax cuts. Our current tax code has all sorts of subsidies for electric cars, real estate, and even racetracks. Ending those subsidies will actually pay for lower tax rates. And finally, the editors recommend that Congress not fall into what they call the deficit neutral trap. The Congressional Budget Office scores budgets, but it does not accurately take into account the economic reaction to changing tax rates. If you lower taxes, the CBO says that you lose tax revenue. But when you lower taxes, more people are likely to invest, and you often end up with more tax revenue. As Congress and the media discuss tax reform, it is worth remembering some of these principles. They will help you sort out some of the information and misinformation during the debate. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
In studio with Greg Laurie today. If you'd like to join us a little bit later, we'll open up the phones. Talking about this new book about Steve McQueen, The Salvation of an American Icon. And also, as we mentioned just a minute ago, have the movie coming out next month. And we have a trailer. So first of all, here's your assignment. Watch the trailer. It takes about 2 minutes and 10 seconds. Then hit that share button and put it on your Facebook page or send it to someone, because I think watching the movie will be as interesting, if not more interesting, than even reading the book by Greg Laurie about Steve McQueen. Now, Marshall Terrell, his own individual, has written a number of other books about Steve McQueen. Yes. So you had a chance to really kind of pull together some really good research, didn't you? Yeah, Marshall has written 5 books on Steve, and I heard him interviewed recently about this book, and he said, you know, his words, Greg forced me to look at this in a different way. Yes. Marshall's a believer, but he had never sort of seen the events in Steve's life that were really leading to his conversion, which go back quite a ways. Right. And so, as you know, I did research for the book. One of the first things I discovered, and you alluded to this earlier, but I didn't know this about Steve, is our childhoods were almost identical. Yes. And I don't think I've ever heard of anyone with a childhood so like mine or mine so like theirs. Steve was born to an alcoholic mother. Her name was Julian. I was born to an alcoholic mother named Charlene. Steve's mother was married and divorced many times. My mom was married and divorced 7 times. Steve never knew his biological father. Right. I never knew my biological father. Steve lived with his grandparents and an aunt and uncle for a time. So did I. Steve was sent to a reform school called the Boys Home in Chino, and I was sent to a military school in Long Beach. So it was so close. And so Steve is quoted, and we have this in the film and audio of him saying this, that, you know, when you have a mother who didn't have time for you and you never knew your father, you basically feel unwanted in life. So Steve developed sort of a shell around him that in some ways made him who he was for better and for worse. And I had that same shell. So as I was writing this book and doing this film, I had a great degree of empathy for him. Like, I know this guy because this is me as a kid. Of course, our paths, went different directions. He became the #1 movie star in the world. But he got into drugs, and I did too. And so Steve, ascended to this massive fame, but he was always searching in a way for his dad. Yeah. And he did finally track down his biological father, but sadly, a few weeks too late, his father had died. And so Steve was always kind of searching for a father figure. So fast forward through all these years in Hollywood with all of his fame and the coolest cars and motorcycles and
women throwing themselves at him literally, and he was a willing recipient of that, I might add.
Yeah.
And then all of the achievements that he had, and he just was disillusioned with it and literally walked away from Hollywood. One tipping point, maybe on top of all the things he had experienced, was he was invited over to the home of Sharon Tate one night. He was close friends with Jay Sebring, who was sort of the hairdresser to the stars of the day. And Steve was on his way over to Sharon's house, and he met a girl and ran off with the girl instead and didn't go. And that was the night the Manson family struck, killed all the people there, murdered them. It was one of the most horrible murders in American history. And then Steve later found out that he was on a hit list that Manson had. So he became very paranoid, used more drugs, cocaine, using LSD, smoking a lot of pot, drinking, everything else. And then he just said he was sort of done. He walked away from Hollywood. He grew his hair out really long, grew his beard out because he wanted to maintain some anonymity. And in his mind, he just had one thing he wanted to learn how to do, which was to fly. Yeah. He was a great driver, so good that he at one point wondered, should I be a race car driver instead of an actor?
Yeah, Grand Prix.
But yeah, exactly. So one of his films, Le Mans, he really drove that car. I mean, this guy really had skills in driving and motocross too. So in this disconnection from Hollywood, I think God was setting the stage because the only man qualified to really train him in the plane he bought, which was an antique Stearman biplane, was a gentleman named Sammy Mason. Sammy was a stunt pilot, kind of a man's man, perfect guy to relate to McQueen, and a strong Christian. And so as they spent hours in the cockpit together, Steve saw something in Sammy, and he said, Sammy, you seem to have a peace. There's something different about you. What is it? And Sammy said, Steve, it's my relationship with Jesus Christ. Sammy shared his faith with Steve, and Steve actually asked Sammy if he could attend church with him. So Steve started attending church and sitting there always in the same spot in the balcony of the Ventura Missionary Church, and the pastor was Leonard DeWitt. So I spoke with Leonard about this. People said, you know, Steve McQueen's in our church. People knew Steve lived in town. He moved there, and it was a small town, and people kind of left him alone. And the pastor said, I know he's here, and I'm not going to bother him. And so one day, Leonard gets a tap on his shoulder. He turns around. It's Steve McQueen. Steve says, Pastor, I'd like to ask you a few questions. Could we go out to lunch? And Leonard said, sure. So they had a 2-hour meal together. And I asked Leonard, what did Steve ask you? He said he wanted to know, could his sin be forgiven? Number 2, he wanted to know if the Bible was reliable. And thirdly, he wanted to know, what does it look like to be a Christian? He's trying to wrap his mind around it. Yeah. He had been Steve McQueen, movie star, Steve McQueen, race car driver, Steve McQueen, Christian?
Yes.
Is this even possible? McQueen was trying to figure it out. And so after Leonard answered all of Steve's questions, the pastor said, I have a question for you, Steve. And Steve smiled and said, I bet you want to know if I become a born-again Christian. And Leonard said, yes, I'd like to know that. And Steve says, yes, I have.
Yes, I have.
I prayed with you a few weeks ago when you gave an invitation for people to come to Christ. So Steve was growing dramatically in his spiritual life. Leonard would meet with Steve every week for an hour of Bible study. Steve was in church every Sunday. He was bringing people to church with him. His life was changing. Those who knew him would talk about the transformation. He was a very self-absorbed man, a very closed-off man because of his upbringing.
Oh, sure.
But all of a sudden, his heart is opening up. He's changing. He's asking people to forgive him that he's hurt. Sounds like conversion to me.
Sure does. Well, and again, I think there are a couple of lessons you can learn from this book, and one of those is how each individual made a difference. First, it was a stunt man.
Yeah.
Then it was a stunt pilot.
Yeah.
Then it was, of course, the pastor. We haven't gotten to Billy Graham yet, but we'll get to that in just a minute.
That's right.
So, you know, that the lesson for our Christian listeners out here is you probably have a prodigal son, a prodigal daughter.
Right.
You wonder if there's ever a possibility of them ever coming to know the Lord. And so that's one of the themes that really runs through your book, don't you think?
I think so. I think this book says no one is beyond the reach of God. Think right now about someone you know that you can't even imagine as a Christian. I mean, let's take people in culture right now. Howard Stern is a Christian. Yeah. Bill Maher is a Christian. Ozzy Osbourne is a Christian. I mean, Johnny Depp is a Christian. Fill in blank here.
Yeah.
None of those people are beyond the reach of God. Madonna is a Christian. Lady Gaga is a Christian. God can reach anyone. And you're thinking of someone in your life, oh, my husband's so hard, my children are so hard, or my neighbor doesn't want to talk about it. Start praying for them and sow the seed. Sometimes God has us sow a seed like stuntman Stan Barrett did in the life of Steve as he shared the gospel with him. Sometimes we water a seed like Sammy Mason, the stunt pilot, did. And
Right.
sometimes we reap where others have sowed and watered, like Pastor Leonard DeWitt. The Bible says God gives the increase. You know, my job is just to water, sow, or reap when the Lord leads. And so I think that this book will inspire people to not give up. And I'll tell you what, another thing, Kerby, this book is like a gospel track. You could give this book and they will hear the gospel. And when they see the film on September 28th, it's beautifully filmed by the Irwin brothers. Fantastic film. But at the end of this documentary film about Steve, I actually share the gospel and lead people in a prayer. So I'm believing that in theaters across the United States, people are going to come to Christ on September 28th.
Well, again, the book is available in your local bookstore. I know that because I bought this particular copy at Barnes & Noble just a few days ago. I want to make sure I had it even before you were in studio because I wanted to read it. And, of course, I always say to every one of my authors, I look at every single page.
Wow.
And so that is something
You
that
are prepared.
I try to be prepared, but more to the point, you should be able to find it in your local bookstore. So you might want to get two copies, one that you can read and one you can have to that difficult, hard to reach friend. And so again, the book, Steve McQueen, The Salvation of an American Icon. We come back, we'll talk a little bit more because we haven't talked about the relationship between Billy Graham and Steve McQueen, although it was fairly short, and some of the other aspects of that. We have a Harvest Crusade coming up, but if you'd like to join us, we'd love to hear from you as well. That number is 1-800-351-1212. If you look on the picture today of Greg Laurie, you will see that we have a link to, first of all, his website. So you can find out all sorts of things that are happening over there at harvest.org. We have, of course, information about the book. We have the trailer there. And my assignment to all of you listening today is get a copy of the book. But even before that, why don't you go and watch the trailer? 2 minutes, 10 seconds. Click that share button. Put it on your Facebook page. Send it to someone. That will start a conversation and get them interested in the movie, which will be out next month. We have a lot more to talk about with Greg Laurie. We'll do that right after these important messages.
Would you like to be above average or exceptional? I'll explain how you can be in a moment. What do you think about change? You know, some people love it, others not so much. I'm guessing you agree our culture needs change. But how will that happen? Change happens with you and your influence. If each of us does our part, God can change the culture through us. That's a goal at Point of View, to help you change things around you. We never charge for the information we deliver each day, but that information is not free. There is a significant cost in getting it to you. You know who helps us do that? About 1 out of every 800 listeners to Point of View. So you can be above average. You can be exceptional by visiting pointofview.net and clicking the banner Change Happens with You, or by calling 1-800-347-5151. Thank you for being exceptional by supporting Point of View. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
If you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Greg Laurie in studio as we talk about this new book, Steve McQueen. But let me, before we get to the book again, talk about the fact that there is also another Harvest Crusade. And this is an opportunity, August 18th to the 20th. You can come in person. For those of you in California, that's not a far drive at all. But for all of us, we can watch on the webcast. And I have found that, Greg, this is just a great opportunity to either watch it on your own or with all of these big TV sets we have in our living rooms now, to invite in some of your neighbors and say, you know, this is a guy who's been writing about Steve McQueen, or this is a guy that I think you'd really enjoy hearing, or we've got Lecrae, or, you know, some other people that they might know, Phil Wickham, and they might just come into your living room and as a result become a Christian. So it's a great opportunity.
And, you know, we have an app, Kerby, called the Harvest app. You just go to the App Store on Android and or iPhone, for tablets and phones, and then, of course, for Apple TV and also for the Roku box. And so no matter what your platform is, we have an app. And when you download this app, you have access to everything we do, lots of archived sermons, and you can watch the Harvest event live on your TV in HD. It's like you're watching a TV station. It's so amazing. And so, you know, you can invite people over to your home and watch us with them. And then as we're inviting people to Christ at the Angel Stadium, you know, they can be coming to Christ in your front room. And we've done this with great success in an event we call Harvest America that we did last year here in Dallas, or actually it's Arlington, Texas, to be technical, AT&T there. And then we just did it in Phoenix at the University of Phoenix Stadium. So, I mean, we know that it works because the Word of God does not return void. And, you know, it goes out powerfully however people take it in person, on a screen, on a phone. So, you know, I hope people take advantage of it. So download that Harvest app for your television and or your phone or tablet.
Well, again, I just love the fact that you're still doing platform evangelism and things of that nature. And, you know, you go back to the First Great Awakening and George Whitefield reaching up and down the eastern seaboard. And, of course, an individual that you've been on the board for many years, Billy Graham, and the impact that these crusades have. And since I'm mentioning Billy Graham, he figures significantly at the very end of Steve McQueen's life. Talk about that, if you might, for just a minute.
So, all right, let's pick up the story where we left off. So Steve has accepted Christ. He's not feeling well, working on the set of a film. He goes to the hospital, and it turns out that he has cancer, mesothelioma.
Yes.
From his exposure to asbestos earlier in his life. They tell him he doesn't have long to live. So Steve wants to fight it, and he wants to fight it for a couple of reasons. Number one, he feels now that he has a message to share with the world about Christ. And so, you know, and who wants to die? I mean, he wants to overcome it. And so he goes to Mexico. He tries some unorthodox treatments that did not help him. And the tumors are spreading. So he had sort of a wish, and it was to meet Billy Graham. So Leonard DeWitt, his pastor, knew some of the team members of Billy. So they contacted Mr. Graham, and Billy agreed to come. And in a little time passed, and Billy hadn't come yet. And so Leonard got in touch with him and said, Mr. Graham, if you're going to come sooner rather than later, because Steve doesn't have much time left. So Billy did come. He spent a lot of time with Steve. Steve talked a lot about his faith, a lot about what Christ had done for him. Billy wrote about it later, about how impressed he was with Steve's conversion, how real he believed it was. And so now fast forward a little bit, and Steve is going to Juarez, Mexico, because there's a surgeon down there that has agreed to remove his cancerous tumors. Steve is just hoping that it might help. So he charters a private plane. And as he is on his way down, he asks Billy to come see him again. Billy comes out to the runway, boards the plane. They have prayer together. And then Steve had misplaced his Bible. And Billy said, here, just take mine. Billy had his Bible with him, his well-used Bible. He signed it to Steve McQueen. I have a photo of it in the book here that you're looking at. And we have video of it in the film. He signed it, I think, to my friend Steve McQueen. May God bless you. And then from Philippians, he who has begun a good work in you will complete it unto the day of Jesus Christ. So Steve took that Bible of Billy Graham's. He went to the clinic in Juarez, Mexico. They did the surgery. It took over 5 hours. The surgeon collapsed from exhaustion. One of the tumors he removed from Steve's body was the size of a baseball. Steve survived the surgery, and they wheeled him into a recovery room, and sadly he had a heart attack and died. And they came in and found him, and his ranch hand, Grady Ragsdale, pulled the sheet back, and Steve was holding on to Billy's Bible.
Yes.
So I had this Bible when I preached in Arizona, and I asked Steve's widow if I could use it. And to think this Bible was, the last thing Steve held. I mean, when you have all the fame and all the wealth that a guy like McQueen had, all of a sudden his cars didn't matter, his motorcycles didn't matter, his beautiful home didn't matter, but that Bible mattered. And when you're on the edge of eternity, you realize the things that maybe you've neglected are the most important things, and the things you gave your greatest attention to are not important at all. And Steve understood that. And funny thing, not funny, but an interesting thing, I told the story in church, and afterwards a man comes up to me who I know he's a member of our church. He says, I was the pilot that flew Steve to Juarez, Mexico. His name is Mike Jugan. I didn't know. I knew Mike was a pilot with Alaska Air, but I didn't know he was the pilot who flew the private plane. He told me the story, so I put him in my film. He's in my book too. But I mean, all these little details coming together, Kerby, to tell this story, I felt like I unearthed something. And in reality, it was always there in plain sight, but somehow unknown to most people.
Yeah. Again, if you get the book, you will see that there's a picture of the Billy Graham Bible and some other things as well as that. And, the point you just made a minute ago is another one of the themes that runs through this book. If you talk about somebody in the 1960s who had it all, and then even into the 1970s, here is an individual, the Great Escape, the Towering Inferno. We talked about Le Mans. Married to Ali McGraw. I mean, he has everything, and yet he had nothing. And there is a lesson for the non-believer listening out there who might think, well, my life will be a little bit better if I get this. And here is an individual who is the king of cool and really had everything the world had to offer, and yet he was empty, wasn't he?
He really was. There's a quote in the book, I'll loosely paraphrase it, from actor Jim Carrey, who's had a lot of success. He said, I wish that everybody could get whatever they wanted in life, be rich and famous, so they could see it's not what they're really looking for. And I think, when you breathe the rarefied air of a person like McQueen, you realize how empty it is. And that's why we should not be shocked when we hear that the lead singer of Linkin Park committed suicide. And that was on the heels of the lead singer of Soundgarden, who was his friend, committing suicide. Ironically, Chester Bennington, the lead singer of Linkin Park, did it on the birthday of his friend Chris Cornell from Soundgarden, killed himself in the same way. And this is shocking to people. Why would a person who's a lead singer in a rock band take their life? Why is drug use so high in Hollywood? Why do they all get into trouble? Because they've seen for themselves these things don't satisfy. Steve saw it too. One of the most amazing people we interview in the film is Mel Gibson.
Yes.
Who, has breathed that rarefied air of a movie star. And he brought insights in the film about Steve as an actor and his craft and what he actually did as an actor. But then Mel also brought insights as to why Steve disconnected from Hollywood and went on that search. Incredible things that he shared. So that's woven into the story as well. So it's a very compelling film. And a word about the Irwin brothers. They directed Mom's Night Out, October Baby, Woodlawn, the soon-to-be released I Can Only Imagine. These guys are top-of-the-line filmmakers. And what I love about them is they make quality films, but they want the message of the gospel in them. So this is a documentary film, but it's beautifully filmed. And we went on location to a bunch of places to tell the story, including in San Francisco, where we drove to the very streets that Steve drove his Bullet car and the film Bullet and other places. And you'll hear from Mel Gibson. You'll hear from the stuntman that sowed the initial seed in Steve's life. You'll hear from Steve's widow, Barbie McQueen, from Leonard DeWitt, his pastor that spent time with him and actually led him to Christ. And then at the end of the film, I share how a person can come to know Jesus. So, look, Kerby, I'm not a filmmaker. I'm a preacher. But film is a vehicle, as radio is, as television is. So we use various vehicles to bring our message. And we want to do it in a high-quality way. what you do here is first rate. We want to do the best we can do, but we never want to compromise our message.
Well, we're going to take a break, and we'll come back and continue our conversation for just a few more minutes with Greg Laurie, and then head out with some of the other activities he has. And, of course, in the second hour, we'll get back into the news cycle. The book is entitled Steve McQueen, The Salvation of an American Icon. The film is coming out next month. As we get closer to it, we'll give you a countdown. We'll give you some links so that you can find out where to watch it and how to use this in an evangelistic way. Just great tools we're putting in your hand to reach out to that unsaved friend, neighbor, maybe even family member with the gospel of Jesus Christ. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. We'll be right back.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Joanne Fratello was hired as the high school principal at St. Anthony's School in New York. She was efficient in carrying out the religious mission of the school. She intimately managed how the education the students received was infused with the religion of the Catholic Church. She personally led prayers for the students over the loudspeaker. She even approved hymn selections and selection of participants of annual masses at the school. Fratello's supervisors found her efforts praiseworthy. They even extended her contract. We don't quite know what happened, but Fratello was suddenly fired. Hurt and angry, Fratello filed a lawsuit alleging discrimination. A 3-judge panel of the Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit concluded that the school was able to claim Fratello as a minister, one who carries out the religious function of the school's religious mission. Therefore, the ministerial exception barred her claims of employment discrimination. As the court concluded, quote, judges are not well positioned to determine whether ministerial employment decisions rest on practical and secular considerations that, though perhaps difficult for a person not intimately familiar with the religion to understand, are perfectly sensible and perhaps even necessary in the eyes of the faithful, unquote. In other words, sometimes religious freedom means allowing religious organizations to be religious, even if you don't understand their religious reasons why. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, your church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Kits at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Greg Laurie in studio. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Might get to a phone call here in just a minute if we have time. But, Greg, I did want to at least pull out one more theme that ran through this book.
Sure.
And that is maybe a vicarious lesson to our parents and grandparents. At the end of his life, Steve McQueen said his mother never told him she was actually proud of him. Mm-hmm. And in light of all of his accomplishments, I know your mother never said that to you as well. There's a lesson to be learned there about how we need to affirm our children and grandchildren, don't you think?
So true, so true. You know, toward the end of his life, Steve said, you know, when you have a mother that never was around for you and you never knew your father, you don't feel like you're loved or wanted. And here's a guy who was loved, in quotes, you know, by so many. But, you know, he really, what he needed was a word of affirmation from his parents. And So for the parents out there, it's really important. I mean, we're always quick to correct our children, tell them they're doing this right or tell them they're doing that wrong. But just tell them, I love you and I'm proud of you. You'd be amazed how far those words would go. And I know they would have meant a great deal to Steve. And I know they'll mean a great deal to your children and grandchildren as well. It's a funny thing, Kerby, as a grandparent, it's easier to sort of lavish affection on grandchildren than children.
I understand that.
It's sort of like a second chance, but it's very important, even if we have adult children, to let them know we are proud of them.
Yes, well, again, I follow you on Instagram. I get to know your grandchildren better than your children. But again, there's some principles there as well. Just before I take some phone calls, though, talk again about some of the resources. I know people kind of tune in and tune out, and you talked about the Harvest app, because this is a great opportunity for people with the crusade coming up August 18th to 20th. Of course, you can have another one in Dallas, and as soon as you get those dates, we'll be announcing that and promoting it like we always do. But it doesn't matter where you are in the world. In light of the internet, you can have a chance to hear Greg Laurie, and you can use this to actually have other people hear the gospel and come to know Christ.
Yeah, that's right. We want to provide tools for folks to use to reach their friends who don't know the Lord. And one of these tools, of course, is this book, Steve McQueen, The Salvation of an American Icon, and now this film. Let me explain how this film works. It's called a Fathom event. Fathom is an organization that will secure a bunch of movie screens across the country, 800 in total. So if you go to our website, stevemcqueenmovie.com, there's a place where you type in your zip code, and it will show you the theaters that are showing it, so you can pre-purchase tickets. So what we're saying is, why don't you buy 2 tickets, one for you and one for your friend that's not a Christian, and bring them to the theater to see it? Because, folks would be a lot more open who are not Christians to go to a movie theater than they would a church many times. They're intimidated by church buildings, but we know that they're going to hear the gospel in this film. It's a very entertaining film. It's a well-crafted film. Every bit one of the finest documentaries I've ever seen, and I think the best documentary on McQueen, but with this spiritual emphasis, especially toward the end. So it's a great tool. But, if you go to our website, harvest.org, that's sort of the portal into our world. We have the Harvest app and all the rest. But the cool thing, you can listen to teaching now and information on demand, just podcasts and things like that. So it uses technology. We're using it for the glory of God. Radio is always a powerful medium, and we're using that right now. But, this is going out on the internet, as you said, and people can see it in other ways. So, I hope people to take advantage of these tools we're putting in their hands.
Well, we worked with that same group, for example, when Franklin Graham was in studio and kind of facing the darkness, and of course on the case for Christ. This is an opportunity to really bring your whole Sunday school class and really motivate people. I've encouraged people, and our own Sunday school classes actually rented an entire theater and then bring in not only your class, but everybody else. And so then you can do all sorts of evangelistic outreaches and things like that.
I would encourage pastors listening, or you could tell your pastor, why don't we buy out the local theater? You could pre-sell the tickets at church and buy the whole place out. And I'm telling you, after they see this film, I believe people will want to accept Jesus Christ. I'm effectively giving Steve McQueen's testimony for him. One of the things that Steve said before he died to Leonard DeWitt was, my only regret in life is I was not able to tell others about what Christ had done for me. So I kind of felt like that wrong needs to be righted. So I'm telling his story now in a way he wasn't able to because his life ended. But now the message goes on. And so I'm using his testimony as a way to point people to the ultimate story, the story of the gospel.
If somebody's listening right now and they've never accepted Jesus Christ as their Savior, and they're hearing about Steve McQueen, one of the things we talked about just a minute ago is he helps you understand that if you had everything, if you're the king of cool, and you're in some of the most watched films, and you are a race car driver and a pilot, and you are dating and in some cases marrying some of the beautiful actresses and other people, it simply does not meet the need that we have. And what is that need? And how can somebody have a personal relationship with Jesus Christ?
Well, God created us in his image, but we're separated from him by our sin. And there's nothing that will ever fill that hole in our heart. Jesus actually said to the woman at the well, if you drink of this water, you'll thirst again. And I think he was using that as a metaphor for life. The well was sort of like, you could take out the word water and it could be the well of possessions, or the well of fame, or the well of sex, or the well of whatever. And, you're created to know God. You are hardwired to know God. The Bible says he has placed eternity in our heart. So Steve finally figured this out toward the end of his life. And you can figure this out right here, right now, because Jesus died on the cross for your sin. You say, well, so what? What do you mean he died for my sin? You're separated from God by your sin, but Christ took your place. He paid a debt he did not owe because you owed a debt you could not pay. But then he rose again from the dead 3 days later. And so if I will turn from my sin and put my faith in Jesus, I can be forgiven. One of Steve McQueen's questions to Pastor DeWitt was, can God forgive me of all of my sins? Steve had many sins. Mm-hmm. He needed forgiven, just like we all do. And the answer, of course, was yes. And so you ask God to forgive you. You turn from those sins. The Bible calls it repentance. And then you follow Jesus. And, you can have a new beginning. You can have a fresh start. Steve McQueen found it, and you can find it too, because Jesus Christ, he's just a prayer away.
Yes. Well, again, we've given you some links to Harvest, so if you even would like to make that decision right now and contact Greg Laurie, I know there's all sorts of resources you love to give to new believers, including Bibles and other things.
I would direct them toward a website we built just for a person like that called knowgod.org, KNOW.org. And if you go there, I lead you in a prayer. I tell you how to follow Jesus. I get your information so I can send free follow-up materials to you. So if you want to know more, tell a friend more, take them to knowgod.org. And again, the website for the film event is stevemcqueenmovie.com.
And we will promote that quite a bit as we get a little bit closer to that. Again, here are your action items. First of all, as the film is coming out, you want to promote that. And so we have already given you a link to the trailer. And so watch it. It's 2 minutes long, and then send it to some other individuals. Get some excitement about that. But even before that, August 18th to the 20th, Angel Stadium, Social Harvest. And again, we mentioned Jordan Sparks, Jeremy Camp, Lecrae, Phil Wickham, and all sorts of other individuals, and most especially Greg Laurie. And this is an opportunity for you to not only hear that, but to bring some people with you first maybe in your living room or something like that. And then as we get closer to the film in the end of September, bring those people to the movie theaters. So Greg Laurie, always great to have you in studio.
Kerby, it's a pleasure, like your new digs here. And I'll look forward to seeing you again sometime.
Well, we had to upscale it a little bit since we knew you were coming here. So again, Greg Laurie with us. Let me just mention again, all of this is available at the website pointofview.net. As you go there, you will see a lot of material that we have provided for you today. So take the time to go to the website, pointofview.net. As you go there, you'll see my daily commentary, which is the Viewpoints commentary, as well as some videos that we encourage you to watch and pass on to others. And if you find yourself saying, I would love to have someone else hear this, click on that button that says listen. You can download the podcast and then send it to someone, or the watch button, since, of course, we are on the YouTube channel, and you can send it off to others or listen to it again. We're going to take a break. We're going to get back into the news cycle. A lot to talk about. North Korea front and center. All that coming up right after this.
Would you like to be above average or exceptional? I'll explain how you can be in a moment. What do you think about change? Some people love it, others not so much. I'm guessing you agree our culture needs change. But how will that happen? Change happens with you and your influence. If each of us does our part, God can change the culture through us. That's a goal at Point of View, to help you change things around you. We never charge for the information we deliver each day, but that information is not free. There is a significant cost in getting it to you. You know who helps us do that? About 1 out of every 800 listeners to Point of View. So you can be above average. You can be exceptional by visiting pointofview.net and clicking the banner Change Happens with You, or by calling 1-800-347-5151. Thank you for being exceptional by supporting Point of View. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
God bless you, Kerby, for keeping this show so on track and for the decades of wonderful help to this nation that Point of View has been. We're all big fans of your work, and we pray that God will just prosper it.
As a Christian, over the years that I've followed this program, I am constantly challenged to be on guard and to evaluate what's going on. And if for no other reason, to protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
This is Point of View Radio.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. For those of you that were listening to the first hour, spent some time in studio with Greg Laurie. New book out, Steve McQueen, The Salvation of American Icon. But now let's get back into some of the news. Let me give you an overview of the rest of the couple of days here. Tomorrow is our Millennial Roundtable, and we'll have some conversation about some of the issues in the news from a millennial perspective. Nick Pitts will be with us. Chelsea Yeoman will be with us. And then Thursday, you will hear the interview that I'm going to do a little bit later today with Dinesh D'Souza. I'll be taping that interview on his new book, The Lie, Exposing the Nazi Roots of the American Left. Fascinating interview, which we'll be playing on Thursday. And, of course, we'll take your phone calls then. And then Friday is our weekend edition. So I hope that you will join us every single day as we get into some of these very important topics. And as we mentioned briefly in the first hour, Greg Laurie talked about North Korea. And I said, well, it is time once again to talk about North Korea. Yesterday was really the first time I've spent any time focusing on that. But there are a lot of reasons now to do so. The first of which is that the Trump administration and the United Nations Security Council were able to pass a resolution which will actually increase sanctions on North Korea. Let me read a little bit from the Wall Street Journal. Then I'm going to talk about the UN Ambassador Nikki Haley, concerned about some of the leaks that could actually endanger lives. And then a piece that's come out in the Washington Post, which I think was one of the lead articles today in Drudge, about some changes that are different than what we talked about yesterday. So this is a fast-moving story. We'll do our best to cover this. But along the way, as we said, we certainly do encourage you to pray for this president. Whether you voted for this president or not, that's immaterial. This president and the generals are going to be making decisions that could affect the lives not only of us, but even more significantly, the lives of people in Japan and South Korea. But let's at least talk about the diplomatic attempt so far. And that is the Trump administration and the United Nations Security Council are heralding the Resolution 2371, which imposes new sanctions on North Korea. But even as this is taking place, North Korea and Pyongyang are sprinting to the ICBM finish line, as they say. The insistence that this resolution will succeed when others failed is, let's be kind, hard to believe. Now, let's talk about it positive and negative. They say on the positive side, the agreement completely bans trade in the North Korean coal instead of capping it. And you might say, well, why is that important? Well, the biggest export in terms of financial benefit to North Korea is coal, accounting for about 40% of its exports, about 10% at least of their GDP. So by not just capping it, but simply banning it, that could be very significant in terms of other kind of economic pain that could be inflicted on North Korea. Now, as soon as we say that, as I've pointed out before, the leaders don't seem to care. I mean, going all the way back to Kim Il-sung, then his son, Kim Il-sung's son, which would be Kim Jong-il, and now, of course, Kim Jong-un, there is just really no concern, I think, about the impact that this would have on their people. But let's hope for the best, and we'll see where that is. There's also in the sanction tightened control over the financial transaction with North Korea. because, after all, Pyongyang has been a primary money laundering concern, and so this might be another issue. But the problem is they point out, the resolution falls short in significant areas. It merely caps the employment of North Korean workers in other countries, which means that the North Korean government can still earn money from exploiting the slave labor of its own citizens to earn currency to fuel that. And, of course, many of these workers are in places like China and Russia, which brings us back to one of the points I've made before. That is, we can't get any kind of significant pressure on North Korea without, of course, the influence of China itself. Of course, the resolution also allows foreign companies and existing joint ventures with North Korea to carry on business. So as good as these sanctions might be, they are probably not going to be enough to stop the ongoing development of ICBMs. This brings me to a second point that has developed, and that is UN Ambassador Nikki Haley has actually been very critical of what seems to be an apparent leak of classified details about U.S. intelligence watching North Korea load up and ship various missiles on patrol boats. And what she said on a broadcast just recently, I can't talk about anything that's classified. If it's in the newspaper, that's a shame. It's incredibly dangerous when things go out to the press like that. And she says, you're not just getting a scoop, you're playing with people's lives. And a lot of this has to do with a scoop that came, interestingly enough, from Fox News. Fox News Pentagon reporter Lucas Tomlinson cited anonymous U.S. defense officials as saying that North Korea is not showing any evidence it plans to halt its missile tests, and instead described a trend that does not bode well for the hopes of de-escalating tensions in the Korean peninsula. So again, those are some stories that have been coming out over the last couple of weeks about North Korea. Just before we take a break, though, let me go to kind of the lead story today. This was the first story listed on Drudge. Comes from the Washington Post. And it changes really everything I said yesterday. If you paid attention to the conversation we had in the first hour yesterday, I said that one of the kind of the last roadblocks for North Korea is, while they have an ICBM that has the ability to travel great distances, and after the break I'll go into some of those details again, so in case you forgot them or were not able to hear them, we'll talk about that. But even having an intercontinental ballistic missile, and even having the possibility of sending that great distances, the fact is they have not had, up until now, a nuclear warhead that you could put on that missile. Well, everything has changed. Washington Post today, lead story, North Korea has successfully produced a miniaturized nuclear warhead that can fit inside its missiles, crossing a key threshold on the path to becoming a full-fledged nuclear power. This comes from U.S. intelligence officials who have concluded this in a confidential assessment. The findings, as they say, are likely to deepen concerns about an evolving North Korean military threat that appears to be advancing far more rapidly than many experts had predicted. U.S. officials last month concluded that North Korea is also outpacing expectations in its effort to build an intercontinental ballistic missile capable of striking cities on the American mainland. Let me come back and, in case you did not have a chance to hear it, give you a little bit of the history of North Korea, South Korea, the Korean War, what North Korea is capable of doing with some of its missiles, and what some of the risks would be if indeed we were to be involved militarily. If you'd like to join us, though, let me also open up the phones. What do you think we should do? Should we just continue down the diplomatic road? Are there possibilities that we could take out the nuclear facilities? And, of course, we'd also have to take out the artillery that is aimed at South Korea. Or do we just simply stand back and allow it to happen? What are your thoughts? And what should we do? If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. We'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, Congress will once again take up the issue of tax reform. Although many of us would love for our taxes to be easy to calculate and simple to file, we know that won't happen in the near future. So what can be done? Well, the editors of the Wall Street Journal published a few principles we can use to evaluate the current debate about tax reform. First, there should be a priority on growth. They said after 12 years of lackluster economy or worse, tax reform's overriding goal should be to lift annual GDP to 3% or more. Second, Congress should make tax cuts immediate. There's a temptation to phase in tax cuts, but that delays any response as investors wait for lower rates in the future. George W. Bush learned that painful lesson in 2001 and corrected it in 2003. Third, make tax reform permanent. Businesses invest with a long tail and won't implement projects if lower rates may evaporate a few years from now. Again, that was a mistake that George W. Bush made. Third, tax reform should entail more than just tax cuts. Our current tax code has all sorts of subsidies for electric cars, real estate, and even racetracks. Ending those subsidies will actually pay for lower tax rates. And finally, the editors recommend that Congress not fall into what they call the deficit neutral trap. The Congressional Budget Office scores budgets, but it does not accurately take into account the economic reaction to changing tax rates. If you lower taxes, the CBO says that you lose tax revenue. But when you lower taxes, more people are likely to invest, and you often end up with more tax revenue. As Congress and the media discuss tax reform, it is worth remembering some of these principles. They will help you sort out some of the information and misinformation during the debate. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
There's three on the table. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Give you a chance to join our conversation today. Let me just also mention some of the other articles we've posted. I will get to those a little bit later if I can. Vote against repeal to protect Planned Parenthood. This was a piece that came out to actually point out that one of the reasons that some of the Republican senators voted against what was called the skinny repeal was because they wanted to protect Planned Parenthood. So that's something I think voters need to pay attention to. We have one about the movie Dunkirk, healing sick minds, and then one, the ghost of Hillary still haunts evangelicals, not to mention my commentary today on tax reform principles. Got a lot more to cover in just a few minutes. But if we can, let's take some phone calls, and we'll take your phone calls as we go along. 1-800-351-1212. We'll go to Maine, first of all, WSEW. And Steve, thank you for joining us today.
Hi, yeah, thank you for taking my call. I guess I have a comment and a question.
Sure.
My comment being that I'm really shocked that there's a lot of comments going around that I've heard that we're shocked at how rapidly they've developed their missile program, when that's not shocking to me at all. And it seems that there's been plenty of intelligence around that they are much more capable than American public GQ gives them credit for.
And I think part of that comes from saying, well, it's a hermit country, and that they are really isolated, and so they don't have access to some of the technology that they would if they were part of the community of nations. And I'm saying, yeah, have you ever heard of things like the black market and covert operations and things of that nature? So good point. Go ahead.
Absolutely. And so on top of that, and you had mentioned that it's what should we do? I think the only thing to do, I don't think sanctions work, or certainly work well or fast enough. I think the only thing to do at this point, and I think this should have been done a long time ago, decades ago, is take out their ability to build these missiles and refine the materials used. And just, I mean, we certainly have the technology and the might and the ability to do that quickly and without a large impact. And actually, shock them into realizing that you don't want to mess with this country.
Well, and again, that may be the possibility. The question, and I'll get into that in just a minute, is with all the artillery that's aimed at South Korea, and in particular at Seoul, whether we would be able to take all of that out. But the question we're asking right now is the question we were asking about whether or not you'd have a nuclear Iran, because if you want to understand how we are incapacitated in terms of foreign policy or military policy to do anything about North Korea, which is, just a hermit nation. It is really isolated from the rest of the world, but that hermit state, nevertheless, is certainly a thorn in our flesh, or it is a problem on the diplomatic scene. Just imagine what it's like to have one of the strongest, if not the strongest nation in the Middle East to have nuclear weapons, and that's the same kind of question we're asking. Bunker busters and things of that nature to take out the nuclear capability of some of these rogue nations is, of course, one of the great challenges, I think, in the 21st century.
Absolutely. So I think the way to do that is you need to move quickly.
Kind of losing you there, but I think gets the point there. Sometimes these cell phones don't work so well. So let's, if we can, give a few more of you a chance to join the conversation if you'd like. 1-800-351-1212. Steve, sorry I couldn't hear the rest of that, so we'll make a point to get back to a couple of calls in just a minute. But some of you might just be saying, okay, can you give me a little context? This is the problem, I think, sometimes with the news. We don't give enough historical context. And it's important to remember that the reason we have a North and South Korea really goes back to the Second World War. Because after the Second World War, the United States took control of what today is South Korea. But the Soviet Union, who had been our ally during World War II, but very quickly began to be sort of our enemy, kind of oversaw communist North, and more importantly, that country that today we call North Korea was backed by China. And so as a result, they began in 1948 to have a split country, just like we've had kind of the split that took place in East Germany and West Germany. This was kind of North Korea, South Korea. That one didn't last very long, because 2 years later in 1950, still under the Truman administration, that's where what today we call North Korea invaded South Korea, and it kicked off the Korean War, which was somewhat devastating, to put it mildly. It was a bloody battle, ended 3 years later. The war devastated the North, despite having around half of the South's population in terms of casualties. But nevertheless, then kind of began to be, if you will, cloistered and removed from the rest of the nations of the world. And so, as I mentioned, it became what a lot of people call a hermit state. First under Kim Il-sung, then under his son, Kim Jong-il, and now, of course, his grandson, Kim Jong-un. And, of course, they have repeatedly blamed the United States for some of their problems. And because of these sanctions, some of that is indeed true. Well, fast forward to the world that we find ourselves in today, and the United States on a couple of occasions has brought sanctions. In 2008, for example, let's give credit where credit was due. Then President George W. Bush issued an executive order labeling North Korea as a national threat. There were various kinds of sanctions that were brought then. Then under then President Barack Obama, about 8 years later, some additional sanctions being brought. And, of course, now the most recent one are the sanctions that we just were voting on in the United Nations, Resolution 2371, that took place this weekend. But the game changer has been twofold. Number one, the development of ICBMs, making rockets, perfecting rockets Not easy to do, as illustrated by those that have blown up on a launch pad or have gone astray. But nevertheless, the possibility now of a ICBM maybe traveling as much as 5,600 kilometers. Some now say that it's possible they could have ICBMs that could travel 6,700 kilometers. Okay, that would certainly not reach all of the United States, but it certainly would allow you to reach Alaska, the islands of Hawaii, probably California. And so that was the first issue, developing a dependable ICBM, intercontinental ballistic missile. The second, as I pointed out just the other day, was the development of a nuclear warhead that could be actually located on those ICBMs. And up until recently, that was still a major issue. But if I, again, can quote from today's lead story in the Washington Post, North Korea now making missile-ready nuclear weapons, and North Korea has now successfully produced a miniaturized nuclear warhead that can fit inside these missiles. That, I would suggest to you, is another game changer. So again, why doesn't the United States just bomb the nuclear facilities? Of course, Steve just mentioned that, and when we come back from the break, I'm going to get into a couple of others that have suggested that maybe something can take place. And so the concern is this. We might be able to take out their nuclear production capabilities, although they understand that that might happen, so have buried them deep underground. So these bunker buster bombs would be necessary. But let's also remind ourselves that the demilitarized zone is only 35 miles from Seoul, Korea, which is, of course, the capital of South Korea. That means that they would certainly be able to reach those with even just artillery. So in taking out their nuclear capability, if this was, as many people believe, a country run by a crazy person, he might simply say, well, then we will retaliate by taking out 40,000, some people estimate as many as 100,000 lives in Seoul, South Korea, or might even launch that artillery towards Japan. And so there are consequences which we would not be necessarily having, although if we did some military strikes, I'm sure we would lose some lives. But the greater loss of life would be in Seoul, Korea, in South Korea, possibly in Japan. And so these are some very important times for us to pray for the president, for the generals, for the Defense Department, and others. But let's take a break. When we come back, we'll take some more of your phone calls. Perhaps you have some thoughts or questions or observations. That number is 1-800-351-1212. A little bit later, if we have some time, we'll move on to a couple other topics that we've posted on our website today. And as you go to the website, take the time to read some of those articles, print them out, send them on. And if you're with us in the first hour, you might, again, want to listen to the interview we did with Greg Laurie about his new book on Steve McQueen, The Salvation of an American Icon. Let's take a break. We'll take your phone calls, 1-800-351-1212. We'll be back right after this.
Would you like to be above average or exceptional? I'll explain how you can be in a moment. What do you think about change? Some people love it, others not so much. I'm guessing you agree our culture needs change, but how will that happen? Change happens with you and your influence. If each of us does our part, God can change the culture through us. That's a goal at Point of View, to help you change things around you. We never charge for the information we deliver each day, but that information is not free. There is a significant cost in getting it to you. You know who helps us do that? About 1 out of every 800 listeners to Point of View. So you can be above average. You can be exceptional by visiting pointofview.net and clicking the banner Change Happens with You, or by calling 1-800-347-5151. Thank you for being exceptional by supporting Point of View. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour. If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Been talking about North Korea. We'll get into a couple of other issues in just a minute, but let me take another phone call. Going back to the state of Maine, this time Bob. Thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Hi, Kerby. Love your show. Just want to mention, I had two thoughts, but I'll just share one. Truman should have let MacArthur cross the Yalu River. I think that's the source of all the difficulties we have in the Orient right now.
Sure, we might just mention the Yalu River is what separates the North Korean border from China. And so the argument is that let's just go in there and clean this thing out. And, of course, that was not the case. And even the way in which the final, quote, resolution of the Korean War took place just left it uncertain. And that's one of the things that people don't realize. A ceasefire is all that we have in Korea. We don't have, if you will, a peace treaty. A peace treaty comes about when a victorious nation actually forces the other nation to sign a peace treaty. We have basically what we have is a ceasefire, and to this day have so many American troops on the border, and perhaps one of the most heavily guarded borders on the demilitarized zone. They have theirs on one side, we on the other. But back to the point, and for our younger listeners, maybe don't know even anything about this, General MacArthur wanted to cross the Yalu River and kind of clean house and resolve some of these leftover issues that were not resolved by the Second World War. But, of course, he was denied that opportunity. I think you wanted to say something else, so educate us if you can.
Well, no, it's something that I recommended as a citizen to the administration regarding Korea, but it would lose its impetus if I mentioned it over the air. But
okay.
Anyway.
Well,
right.
Bob, thanks for calling. But again, just a little bit of a history there for those of you that are not familiar. And that's why I like to go through some of this history, because a lot of people say, well, how did we end up with North Korea and South Korea? Well, that goes all the way back to the end of World War II, where the Soviet Union oversaw the communist North Korea, which had some communists in it, and thus turned it into a communist state. Which, by the way, as I've shared yesterday, but it's worth mentioning from time to time, that when you every year, and we usually in the fall, have that list that comes out of the places where there is the greatest persecution of Christians, 9 out of the top 10 are Muslim countries. No surprise there. It kind of relates to some of the conversation we had yesterday in the first hour. But interestingly enough, we also see that one of the other issues that is front and center is North Korea. Usually it's number one on the list. And so if you are a Christian, you are probably going to face more persecution and perhaps even face the possibility of being martyred in North Korea more than any other country in the world. So there are reasons, even apart from the fact that they have nuclear weapons, to want in and to go and clean house and to rectify some of the problems. But we are very uncertain as to what the future might hold. So those are just a few facts, figures, statistics, and a little bit of history to help you understand this ongoing discussion we're going to have about North Korea. Just before we end the program, though, I wanted to get to some of the articles I've posted, and one of those relates to the issue of Planned Parenthood. We've talked about this from time to time, but I think it's kind of interesting to recognize that 2 of the U.S. senators who voted against what was called the skinny repeal. What you're talking about is the idea of repeal and replace did not work for Obamacare or the Affordable Care Act. So the idea is, well, let's just have a small repeal, which won't be implemented for a couple of years, but then it would put the onus on us to go back and to try to come up with an alternative. Well, as we well know, the assumption was that there were enough votes, but then John McCain changed over. But some of the other individuals that voted for it explained why. And the other day on CNN, Dana Bash had Senator Susan Collins from Maine and Senator Lisa Murkowski from Alaska. And, of course, Dana Bash was just thrilled about the fact that they actually voted against the so-called skinny repeal. And Susan Collins, Senator Collins, admitted that it was an uncomfortable vote, but both Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski insisted that they thought it was the right thing to do, and frankly said they did not fear any backlash from the Republican leadership, which I thought tells you everything. Because as I've pointed out before, if there is one thing that you have to give credit to Chuck Schumer, it is that all 48 Democratic senators all have voted continuously in lockstep. And on the other side, trying to get 51 votes on the Republican side has been, as they've said many times before, like herding cats. But it was interesting that in the midst of all of this, there were the argument that indeed the reason they voted against repeal was not because they were so concerned about what would happen with the issue of Obamacare or the Affordable Care Act, but more concerned about the fact that the skinny repeal actually called for a defunding of Planned Parenthood. And so Susan Collins said, quote, "The issue of family planning services," which basically, you know what that means, abortion, cancer screenings, which are really pretty rare, and women care probably does resonate with us more than it does with our male colleagues, and to me it was unfair to single out one Medicaid provider and say to women in particular, you can't choose which healthcare provider you want to go through. So in some respects, we now have them actually admitting that it was indeed the issue of Planned Parenthood that caused them to not vote for the idea of repeal of Obamacare or the Affordable Care Act. Now, the counter argument that has come from a number of people is that over 300,000 abortions last year were performed by Planned Parenthood. Nearly 50% of their income, according to insiders, come from that, although they always make a case that it's only a small fraction of it. Well, I don't think so, but nevertheless, we can cover that story on another day. But it's an illustration, again, that even when you think you're voting on the issue of health care, what really was the motivating reason, at least one of the motivating reasons for both Senator Susan Collins and Senator Lisa Murkowski was the issue of Planned Parenthood. So I wanted to post that particular article for you just to consider as well. Another article I've posted is by our good friend David French, in which he points out, as the title of the article says, the ghost of Hillary still haunts evangelicals. He says whenever he speaks to evangelical audiences, he can almost always predict the response, because if he says anything that might be critical of President Trump, he says, after the speech, I was speaking to a small group of Christians when an older man walked up, glared at me, and said, "You just wanted Hillary." He said, "I did not." But he says conversations like this have happened time and again, and he says it's time to answer all the critiques. Worried that Trump's team lied about the extent of their contacts with Russia, he says Hillary. Concerned about chaos in the West Wing, Hillary. Alarmed about the failure of Obamacare repeal and obvious lack of presidential leadership, Hillary. And what he's making the point is something we've talked about before. We can, on the one hand, say certainly this president has been much more significant in terms of some of these issues than others, but at the same time, we need to come up with maybe a little better answer to some of that. So I wanted to post this because he's had for some time individuals that every time he makes even a comment about how some of the government has been dysfunctional, the reaction is, well, it's better than Hillary. And the answer is, well, yeah, that's certainly the case. Don't deny that possibility. But I think we need to come up with a little bit better answer. So, again, I wanted to post that for you just to give you a chance to hear a little bit more about David French's comments and some of the concerns he has that sometimes we don't have as good an argument as we might want to have. Let's take a break, though. When we come back, I want to, for just a few minutes, since we are talking about North Korea, end with a piece that I've posted by Katie Kiefer called Dunkirk, Healing Sick Minds. If indeed we ever go to war again, and let's hope we never have to, but the reality is sometime in the future we may, we have a much different kind of mindset than we had in the past. When we talk about the greatest generation, individuals standing in line, volunteering to serve in the military to fight in World War II. Some of the same kind of mindset with the Korean War. But by the time you get to the Vietnam War and then later, a real hostility to the idea that we should ever go to war, that anything is worth dying for. And today, of course, if it weren't for the significantly patriotic people that serve in our voluntary military, I suspect you would never even have that as well. Well, she uses the example of this new movie, Dunkirk, to just illustrate again some of the issues that are, I think, going to surface if indeed we get involved in any kind of military action with North Korea. So before we end the program today, I wanted to read from that particular piece, and of course also point you to some articles we've posted on the website, pointofview.net. Let's take a break. We'll come back and talk about Dunkirk right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Joanne Fratello was hired as the high school principal at St. Anthony's School in New York. She was efficient in carrying out the religious mission of the school. She intimately managed how the education the students received was infused with the religion of the Catholic Church. She personally led prayers for the students over the loudspeaker. She even approved hymn selections and selection of participants of annual masses at the school. Fratello's supervisors found her efforts praiseworthy. They even extended her contract. We don't quite know what happened, but Fratello was suddenly fired. Hurt and angry, Fratello filed a lawsuit alleging discrimination. A 3-judge panel of the Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit concluded that the school was able to claim Fratello as a minister, one who carries out the religious function of the school's religious mission. Therefore, the ministerial exception barred her claims of employment discrimination. As the court concluded, quote, judges are not well positioned to determine whether ministerial employment decisions rest on practical and secular considerations that, though perhaps difficult for a person not intimately familiar with the religion to understand, are perfectly sensible and perhaps even necessary in the eyes of the faithful, unquote. In other words, sometimes religious freedom means allowing religious organizations to be religious, even if you don't understand their religious reasons why. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, your church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Kits at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
For a few more minutes, if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212, or else just sit back for just a minute because I wanted to read this piece by Katie Kiefer, Dunkirk, Healing Sick Minds. Now, as a disclaimer, let me just mention that I have not seen the movie Dunkirk. Almost everybody around me has. Just one of those accidents of scheduling. I wasn't sure if I was going to go by myself or my family. But anyway, that is irrelevant actually to the commentary that she has here that I think really helps us understand if indeed we find ourselves in some kind of military confrontation with North Korea or other terrorist nations, what that might mean. So she begins by saying that Roman historian Titus would love the new World War II movie Dunkirk because he believed that the study of history is the best medicine for a sick mind. hence why she titled Dunkirk Healing Sick Minds. Now, he was not only the only Roman thinker to value this. Marcus Cicero, for example, one of Rome's greatest and finest orators, concurred, to not know what happened before you was born, before you was to live as a child. And, of course, James Madison even agreed with the Romans' warning that a well-instructed people alone can be permanently a free people. So the issue here is, can we learn from some of these movies or books about war? And whether it's Dunkirk, whether it's Saving Private Ryan, whether it's the Mel Gibson movie we just mentioned a minute ago when we were talking with Greg Laurie, or a variety of others, we can see that in some respects there's some real opportunities to educate people. But at the same time, because Katie looks at the feminist argument, she's well aware, and I think she alludes to this a little bit later as we read this, to the fact that some of these feminists have been upset with the movie because it doesn't show women. Well, that's because, first of all, the story's about men. But she does a little bit later talk about a few of the women in the movie. But nevertheless, she goes back to this idea of healing sick minds. She says suffering from a mental illness, immature, or the danger of serfdom is how these three renowned thinkers describe a citizen who is historically illiterate. Tomorrow, I would like to maybe have that conversation with our Millennial Roundtable about the fact that the younger you are, sometimes the less likely you are to know about some of the history. And so she says, alarmingly, then polls show that the average American adult has a very weak grasp of history, and the majority of Americans do not fully understand the Constitution or the three branches of government. And she's got an HTML link to some of that as well. She says history books in American classrooms are becoming so politically correct that some states are formally inviting parents to challenge the text. For example, for our listeners in Florida, you may know that your governor, Rick Scott, signed HB 989. It's called the Instructional Materials Bill, and it actually empowers parents to challenge classroom materials that include revisionist, in other words, inaccurate accounts of U.S. history and world history. And so she says the good news is that the British-American film director Christopher Nolan, famous, interesting enough for his Batman movies, has reinvigorated Americans with a zeal for historical accuracy. Nolan's new blockbuster hit, Dunkirk, serves history straight up. There are no rocks in this drink, no training wheels on the bike. Intense is not intense enough word to describe Dunkirk. It's simply a tidal wave of truth. She says Dunkirk is like one huge wave that crashes in on you for 106 minutes. You want to cry, choke, run, and then it's over. 106 minutes felt like 16, and you immediately want to watch it again. The story follows Allied soldiers, many of them 18 and 19-year-old boys, who were hopelessly isolated on the beaches of Dunkirk in the spring of 1940. The soldiers' challenge, according to Nolan, it really was a question, he says, of whether they could miraculously escape before having to either surrender or be annihilated by the Germans. That was the choice, surrender or annihilation. Nolan's film is a hit with the general public, but he has many critics in the media who are upset that the soldiers in this film are mostly male and white. Well, there's a reason for that. That's what they were. She then quotes from feminist commentators like Marie Claire's particular author, fuming that Nolan dared to tell a story of Dunkirk in a factual way. She wrote, Dunkirk felt like an excuse for men to celebrate maleness. If Nolan's entire purpose is breaking the established war movie mold and do something different, why not make a movie about women in World War II? Well, at this point, Katie Kiefer says, well, first of all, Ms. Bonner, this is a free country. You may certainly make such a movie yourself. Second, it was men who fought on the front lines in World War II. But the real question is, why make such a comment? The movie does not detract from women merely because it features men. And so Katie goes on to say, truth is not demeaning to women. Rewriting history is demeaning because it minimizes the value of women, like my grandmother who served in World War II as a nurse while dating a Marine who would eventually become my grandfather. She fought a different battle on the home front while also enduring the hardship of missing her beloved and not knowing sometimes for weeks whether he might be injured or even dead. She never called herself a soldier. Katie goes on to say that in Dunkirk, Nolan also made the supposedly controversial decision to portray good men as good. Moreover, Nolan encourages us to admire courage more than to see it, as many directors would, as weakness or naivete. In Dunkirk, there's no Frank Underwood, no anti-hero who's glamorized for clawing his way to raw power. Instead, we see many men of all ages making real sacrifices, risking all they have to help others and protect their country. We don't see, but we know that there are many women making sacrifices too, women whose husbands, sons, and brothers took their small recreational and fishing vehicles and boats over their treacherous English Channel waters, and brave bombs falling from the sky to save roughly 338,000 troops in a mission called Operation Dynamo. She does point out in a closing scene there's a fleet of small boats and cruises to actually rescue the soldiers. We see one woman standing on one boat along with an all-male crew. Her shoulders are thrown back and her head is high. The only thing moving above this brave, statuesque soul is her long, dark skirt beating in the wind. We get the sense that she is single, a recently married woman with no children yet under her care, a woman who risked her life to offer soldiers and troops first aid and comfort. And early in the film, we see another woman on a large boat, a professional nurse in uniform offering soldiers toast and tea. She says it's apparently hard for liberals to watch a movie like Dunkirk because it tells the truth about men and women, that they are different, and that these differences allow society to flourish even amid the chaos of war. The story of Operation Dynamo, told factually, shows that when ordinary men and women with strong moral compasses do that thing at which they are respectively better, fighting versus nurturing, miracles can happen. Few words are uttered in this movie, she says. The characters' actions speak for themselves. You walk away from Dunkirk motivated to be noble and courageous, and that is the power of telling truthful history. Nothing else, a great antidote to some of the revisionist history that we've talked about so often here on Point of View. And it's the third article we've posted for you today on Point of View. Let me just mention, if you missed the interview we did with Greg Laurie in the first hour about his new book, Steve McQueen, I would encourage you to go back and listen to it. I would encourage you to get a copy of the book. And we've also posted a trailer of the movie that's coming out next month. My assignment to you is to watch the trailer. It's about 2 minutes long. Then hit the share button. Send it to something. Maybe your Facebook page. Maybe you have a blog. Maybe you put it on a Twitter post. Maybe you have an email that you want to send it to someone, and encourage people to consider going to the film next month. We'll spend a lot more time talking about the film next month when we get close to its release date, but we wanted you to know about that right then. And if you'd like to find some of the articles, they're all available at our website, pointofview.net. I want to thank Andrew and Elisa, as well as Steve, for their help behind the scenes. Join us tomorrow for our Millennial Roundtable right here on Point of View.
Would you like to be above average or exceptional? I'll explain how you can be in a moment. What do you think about change? Some people love it, others not so much. I'm guessing you agree our culture needs change. But how will that happen? Change happens with you and your influence. If each of us does our part, God can change the culture through us. That's a goal at Point of View, to help you change things around you. We never charge for the information we deliver each day, but that information is not free. There is a significant cost in getting it to you. You know who helps us do that? About 1 out of every 800 listeners to Point of View. So you can be above average. You can be exceptional by visiting pointofview.net and clicking the banner Change Happens with You, or by calling 1-800-347-5151. Thank you for being exceptional by supporting Point of View. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you